put your hands together for Chander Damodaran. Over to you, Chander.
Thanks, Amit. Good afternoon, Pune. How's everyone? How's your energy levels? Especially after a good lunch. And somebody was telling me, it takes about 30 minutes after you have had lunch for your sleep cycle to come, start hitting you. And interestingly, I start just after lunch. So I will be done by the time your sleep cycle hits. So hopefully we'll keep those energy levels high for each of you and, get you guys excited about the future of interfaces, which we're going to talk in a minute. So the way I've tried to structure this storyline for you, and we can have a more, interesting discussion and debate maybe a little later, once I'm done with the session. But the broad thinking is, what is essentially driving this whole API world, right? What is this thing about API economy, subscription economy people keep talking about, right? Everything is now as a service. We know we want everything as a service today. So what is really driving that world, right? So let's talk about and see what is really driving that trend. And then let's look at how these API, is kind of evolving. Let's look at the reference architectures around how you typically try to structure your thinking, right? And then let's look at some of these, do you want to kind of build everything ground up, or do you want to kind of leverage and tap into some of these commercial solutions that are out there and kind of use that to your advantage, right? Or, and then look at some of the learnings and sessions, the problems that we have faced while building these interfaces, and how have we, kind of run through it, right? And more importantly, I want to kind of keep some thoughts for you to look at how is this world shaping up, right? And some of them can be trends, some of them can be complete anti-patterns, right? So we can talk about some of those, and that's the thinking that I want to kind of excite you with, right? It's not about me talking about APIs. I'm sure everybody does, know what is APIs, but what is important is how do you adapt to these APIs in this new world. So that's the part about it. I think Amit did a great introduction, so I don't want to jump into this. But one fundamental difference that we do as an organization, Brillio, right, is our approach to how we solve problems. For us, it's all about, you may be part of a manufacturing industry, you may be part of an automotive industry. I think some of the examples that was coming out in the plenary session when we were talking early in the morning, it was about, hey, you as an organization, you are either already in the digital world or you're transforming into that whole digital world, right? So digital is here to stay and it is part of your mainstream. So either you are adopting to it or you're already on that bandwagon. Now, what is driving that? Let's talk to some examples. So we call this API as this whole digital glue. Why do we say that? If I go and talk to a large enterprise who has made millions of dollars of investment and he has built all his current IT systems that is trying to solve his current needs, you go and tell him, here is a great new technology that's coming on board, there's blockchain, there is AI, VR, chatbots, this, that, let's go build something new. It doesn't mean that I have to let go of all the investments that I have made and build something net new, or should I essentially think of rewiring the current set of systems that I have and try to build it for the new world, right? So that's one dimension of thinking that you have to start looking at, which is what your existing investments are. How do you start to leverage those investments into your roadmap and then kind of rewire it for the new digital world, right? Because today, I think there were some examples that came out from the other sessions as well. Today, we have more connected devices than humans connecting into the internet, right? And today, it's all about connected economy. It is driven through, the subscription base, right? Everything is services. So what is important is what you have invested today as your internal IT systems. They may be connected, they may not be connected, but an important dimension to think is, can I rewire them to the new world, right? So that's one dimension that is driving the API thinking. The second important dimension is all these cool things that we keep talking about, right? We're talking about today connected systems, connected everything. And a lot of that is coming from, your IoT, the convergence of cloud, IoT, SDN. They drive actually new business opportunities. And all of this needs to be meshed together in some kind of a, thinking. And what would that be, right? How do you essentially wire yourself for this new world, right? So that is the second dimension that we will talk. So what I will do is, through the rest of this, conversation that I will be driving through, I want to actually talk about how
you adopt API for your current set of things that you already invested, but at the same time, look at how you kind of wire yourself for the future, right? Somebody talked about, in one of the sessions, about digital obsolescence. Digital obsolescence comes in when you start going a point in time. How do you rewire yourself? And how do you kind of attune yourself to the changes that is happening in this new world? I think that is the thinking that you have to start looking at when you are wiring your systems. And one of the roles that I play is around solving those kind of problems, right? So let's look at what is driving that change, okay? So fundamental change, if you've seen, again, I don't know how many of us are in that 20, 15 years category, and some of them are your millennials and the net new people. But if you've seen the world of how your application architecture used to be built, we used to do client server, or we used to probably do this entire architecture, 3 tires, 5 tires, 10 tires, and I don't know how many other tires. Now as men, we start putting more tires into our body. That's also there. But I think what is important is, today the world is moving towards microservices architecture, right? Everybody says microservices, and there are new words like nanoservices and all kinds of services, right? And everything is a service, okay? So that's one dimension that is kind of making a fundamental paradigm shift in terms of how you start thinking. Now let's look at the infrastructure. Today, we keep talking about, the days of boxes to large boxes to now it becoming, virtual servers to hyperconverged infrastructure to essentially now containers that is driving some of the next trends, right? Development processes starts from your waterfall to agile to now we talk about continuous delivery, right? We don't talk about features, we talk about continuous dashboards. Kanban is a way of life, right? Everything starts around that. Again, from an infrastructure perspective, we talk about data centers, we talk about hosted systems, and now we talk about cloud, and we talk about hybrid infrastructure, right? Today, what is happening is either your infrastructure, your development methodologies, the way you deliver your services, all of that is going through a paradigm shift, okay? And in this, one of your key dimensions is API. So API, when we keep talking about as a digital glue, it is essentially stitching a lot of these different things together, right? We start seeing huge amounts of data coming in, multiple data sources. We used to build out these big, large data warehouses. We used to slice and dice through those data and whatever, right? Today, the world is moving towards a very data lake, kind of an architecture. So what you're seeing is differentiation in terms of how you approach. You start seeing changes happening in every one of these. And looking at, the bottom line, which is what I've kind of highlighted, use this as your reference when you start thinking through your problems, your areas that you want to engage, and use that to your solution advantage, right? I think for us, it is about looking at what is the major market indicators, what are the changes that is happening, and how do you adopt these changes in a world, either in a world where you already have made investments or in a world where you're essentially building net new, right? So keeping that relevance, I think, is an important dimension when you start looking at how you wire it. And the approach that I was telling about in Brillio, we do this with the problem, solutions, and with solutions, then you think of your technology as a lever or an enabler to drive that change. You do not have to be dogmatic about, hey, I have Java, and hence I have to do everything around Java, right? It can, the world keeps changing. Today, everything is fundamentally changing. So how do you rewire yourself with that new world? So that, starts driving. So what is this new economy? We keep talking about subscription economy. What is that fundamental large building block that you want to call, which is driving this change? So, as I said, one thing is today your infrastructure is completely virtualized, right? Nobody really cares. We talk about as containers, right? We as part of our development methodologies, I would probably be putting it into some kind of a Docker, and then that Docker can probably go into some kind of a Kubernetes cluster, and that is basically deployed somewhere either on-premise or on cloud. I don't really care. What I care for is, as a business user, do I get my experiences right? I don't really care what the infrastructure is. That is a change in the way we now operate with our infrastructure today. You look at Azure as an example, right? The world of creating Windows and Windows boxes is now changing, and fundamentally now we have an Azure stack that allows you to kind of move things from on-premise to cloud or get into kind of a hybrid scenario, right? And again, there are multiples of examples of that, when I can talk about. API now becomes our intermediate mesh layer that essentially drives that. How do I stitch all of these things together? How do I glue all of these different things together, right? And then you start having your front-end experiences. And front-end experiences could be through your standard desktops, it could be through APIs, or it could be, as in your mobile devices, or it could basically be through one of these connected devices, right? Your smart devices, etc. They all start driving this fundamental change. If you keep these three dimensions again in mind, this essentially gives you that large, building blocks that I would call for driving, or wiring yourself for the future, right? So that's the thinking. So there are a bunch of benefits that we keep talking, and as I said, we can have a separate conversation once we are done, and we can talk through each of these in a lot more detail. But what this kind of drives us to is, since this is supposed to be a deep tech session, and I have to go into some of the details, I'm going to dive in through some details, which is of importance to some of our dev people who are out here, right? When we keep talking about API, it is not just about building APIs. It is about what all goes into that ecosystem of that mesh architecture that drives your API thinking, okay? So when I say that, what do I mean? How are you thinking about delivering your APIs? What's your deployment, what's your development methodology? What's your deployment methodology? How are you changing, how are you doing change management? How are you doing versioning? How are you running through that process, right? 5 developers are building out net new features, and today we are going into a complete continuous delivery mode, right? So today you're building features as it keeps happening, and you're essentially, building it as part of either an agile train or as a Kanban process. So how are you controlling how your API is basically built and deployed? 2, your APIs are becoming much efficient, right? You either build it as a functional block, or you build it as something that does a specific activity. And then what you do is you start compose those things together, right? And then you start addressing a business need. And these business needs can change, and hence you wire your system to adopt to that. So are you thinking of orchestration really well, okay? What also comes in is, okay, now I orchestrated, I was talking to somebody at the booth, and the person was telling me, we source a lot of data from different sources. Each of it costs a huge amount of money. I don't have a mechanism as to how do I, charge it back to my different my different groups within the devices, or within the organization, right? And that comes in with your API analytics, the ability for you to think of how do you want to throttle your APIs, who gets to see what. You have a gold package, platinum package, subscription packages, right? So there's a way that you can actually start delivering experiences. Or you can actually control how much of hits does a specific API gets. Or even to understand where your APIs are actually failing, and how do you, essentially start building that whole self-healing kind of a thinking around it. And for you to do that, the first thing is to actually start gathering data. How do you gather the data? How do you analyze the data? And how do you react to that data either in real time or near real time, or once a week, whatever is your way of doing it. But that kind of starts kicking in as well. We talked about multi-channel experiences. How are you thinking of your various mediation methodologies? What are your ways, right? I may connect through a mobile phone, I may connect through different devices, I may connect through my smartwatch. What are my ways in which I'm basically mediating, and how am I wiring, not having to re-engineer my systems again and again? See, I think the important part here that I'm trying to drive as message is being relevant and being future ready. For you to do that, you will have to ensure that you address different dimensions that starts kicking in when you're thinking of your development methodology, or in terms of your APIs, right? So a lot of these starts kicking in, and we can go through every aspects of it. How many of you are in this group, like security experts? How many of you do security as your way of life? Anybody? Okay. So again, APIs from security. If probably, we talk to, sorry, I don't know your name, but, let's say you talk to security and talk about API. Basically, my, aspect of API security is probably I have a mechanism to, encrypt my payload using some kind of a WS standard, or I could probably think of an authentication authorization mechanism, or I basically put it as a transport, security. That's probably what my thinking of an API could be. But API, when you talk of security, there is something called as your north-south, which is what I just talked, top-down, right? You're basically controlling through either a gateway, you could have some kind of services layer in between, and there could be multiple things. That is essentially your top-down, north-south security. But when you talk about a container-based architecture where you have your APIs basically sitting in some kind of Dockers, and then these basically goes into some kind of physical boxes or into a cloud, as it may be, there is something called as the east-west security that starts kicking in. Okay? Again, I don't want to go into the details of it, but essentially when you think of it, if I have 5 APIs basically grouped into a container and basically deployed, there is nothing that is preventing a malicious coder to actually create something that basically calls another service. How do you prevent that such things, right? So there are a lot of ways that you can do. So east-west security also kind of starts kicking in as well. So what I'm saying here is API, when you start thinking, it's not just about building, somebody gives this broad definition. If you go look into the internet, what is microservices? They will say it is anything between 10 to 100K lines of code. That is microservices. We have customers who write 10,000 lines of code and they still call it microservices, right? So you will have to deal with those kind of examples as well. Just because they put it onto a Java Spring Boot, they basically say it's microservices. It is not, right? So there's a differentiation in way you think, but more importantly, it is to also start grouping them into logically and address different dimensions of the stakeholders that kicks in, right? You can have your security experts coming in, you could have your business stakeholders coming in, you could have your technical IT people coming in. There are multiple people coming in, right? You will have to address, and that's part of your architecture thinking when you're thinking of your APIs. Now, having said all of this great stuff, what are my ways in which I do this? So today, I can think of creating this as, custom solutions. I can build everything. I want to do everything on my own. Again, I come from an era where system development and all of those things was, very good, and everything had to be done by us, right? I probably come from that kind of a dimension. Today, the world is changing, and you kind of tap into industry-grade products which are just wired for solving such problems, and you build on top of it, right? We have very good examples of industry API solutions. You can talk about APG, you can talk about MuleSoft, you can talk about open source solutions like WSO2, and there are many more of these that basically gives you a lot of these capabilities to actually start getting your basic infrastructure or the ecosystem that I was talking about in the previous slide kind of come together, okay? And then what you can think of is you can focus on your core logic of what you want to wire for, right? And then you can start building around it. So just to give you kind of a sneak peek into how we have been wiring our, with our customers in this whole microservices journey, you fundamentally say that, look at the bottom half of the system as something that is already been invested. People have already built. You could have, messaging queues. People can basically write standard, end-tier applications, or they could basically write a monolith. It could be like you're, connecting to mainframes as well. But what essentially that all becomes is your core bottom layer of your system, or it's a southbound side of the systems, right? And what you essentially build out is that middle layer, which we call as our mesh architecture, which is fundamentally defined through APIs and services, okay? So let's look at that as our intermediate layer. So look at this as a way where how many of us, live in a society, how many of us know our neighbors well? Right? Probably we don't. And probably it's one of these days when I know my next door neighbor. But look at your mesh layer as that connector that starts connecting all of you together, right? Starts building that ecosystem. You may be an independent mainframe system, or you could be a siloed Java application, but I have the ability to now start stitching these things together. Obviously, I'll have to rewire some of them, right? There are some amount of changes that I'll have to do, but I start making that shift through this middleware layer, right? And have some kind of an API gateway that allows you to abstract your underlying systems. That's another way of securing your internal systems, but at the same time, exposing the functionalities, right? Security and experiences kind of contradict one another. You want great experiences, that basically means you will have to enable more. But when you start enabling more, security starts to pull it down. So you kind of play a balance between how you wire that and how do you think of it. So what you do is you start grouping your APIs into different aspects, right? You want to work with your own internal system. Say, for example, I have an e-commerce application, I have my HRM systems. I want to kind of wire them so that they start leveraging this common mesh layer. Then you have a mechanism where you have expose it through an internal APIs channel, in which case there is nothing, there is no, you have your basic tenets of security, but you broadly allow it to kind of run through it. But if you're connecting through partners, you're pulling in some data sources from some external places, then you have to start having your guards up, and you'll have to address it in a different way. You want a mechanism where you want to expose this to third party, right? In the sense of development community. You want to start actually having them to think through, then basically make some of those test beds that allows you to start driving through it, okay? So what does this all lead to? Again, when I say we keep talking about future of interfaces, essentially the way you wire for it is how do you ensure that future proofing kind of happens at your API layer? And to drive that, a bunch of things starts kicking in. So the key point that I want to highlight here is think of that software development kit-based approach. So whether it is your Java or your .NET, you had a mechanism where the version upgrades did not impact you much unless there was some kind of a deprecation that happened. And that deprecation allowed you to, it gave you enough time for you to kind of rewire it. So think on that approach, right? Because that works wonderfully well and it's a tested model. You don't have to, we don't have to, when we say innovation, it doesn't have to be net new, right? It is about essentially thinking how do you adapt to changes. So one of the things that we approach in our design when we go through this API thinking is to look at what drives your tech stack. Again, as I said, one of the key thinking is technology should not be your driver. It should be the problem and the solution thinking approach. Use that and then think of what would be the customer's ecosystem. If the customer's ecosystem is primarily driven through an open source community, then you should be wiring your thinking around that, right? You can't basically now then go and change this complete system design, which basically is going to not align well with you. So think through the right tech stack. Go through the right API model. Microservices is a hot word. Everybody talks about it. But it's not everything has to be microservices. Some of them can still be APIs. If you want to connect to some of the mainframes, et cetera, you still can't do microservice-based thinking. But microservices gives you an advantage. There are multiple frameworks that are out there, right? If you are working in AWS, for example, you have your whole Lambda services that kind of kicks in, right? You use Azure, you use Azure Functions. You're writing it through on Java, you can do it using your Spring Boot, right? There are multiple ways that you can do it. All of these frameworks, or in .NET you have the service fabric. Each of these layers, they give you that ability to do self-healing, auto deployments, recoveries, right? So those are some of the functions that you want to tap into when you're thinking of your, your API design itself. So think of all of those thinking. And then when we talk about interface designs, think about what do you want to do, right? How do you want to pass your payloads? How do you want to secure your payloads? So think of that. Have the mechanism to actually have these autocode generated, et cetera, right, as part of your API design. And more importantly, think of how you want to expose these services back. Should it be client-specific, partner-specific, your internal consumptions, or you wanted to have basically some kind of get-started guides, both for helping all your teams, right? So think of all of this as part of your API design framework that should help you with your, your broad approaches. What this then, what we have done is I've just given an example of how we compared and contrast three important frameworks in this, right? One is WSO2, which is an open source framework that other than giving you ESB API capabilities, it gives you a lot more, right? So for people who are interested, you can look at the entire WSO stack. You can also look at, we also looked at APG and MuleSoft. These are two areas where we, we extensively work. We are helping, for example, some of our customers in rewiring their entire digital bank using a microservices approach that is primarily based on Mule. Now, in this example, we are connecting to backend Fiserv systems, which are like your core banking systems. But then more importantly, what we are also doing is we are rewiring some of the thinking around how we use MuleSoft around it, right? APG is another example where we are working extensively. APG kind of comes in from that open banking as well. If you, I don't know how many of you are working in the open banking space. So APG has a productized version of their API solution on APIs, right? So what we have done is to kind of take those, those attributes that we had listed out, and we have broken it down for each of them from a design development perspective, from an analytics perspective. So for example, if you see APG, it actually starts very high on the analytics part, the ability for me to kind of draw insights, get a sense of how your API is actually being used, right? It gives a very, very strong indications. When you look at MuleSoft, MuleSoft comes with a very strong ESB capabilities, right? So if you have a mean where you need to kind of interface with multiples of systems, your MuleSoft works very, very well. So think of how you want to kind of wire through your systems and what is required, and that kind of drives a lot of your thinking. Again, this is based on our understanding and how we have wired using these three technologies. Again, this is not the full summary of everything that you think is there. There are many more, right? And there are many more solutions that are out there. In fact, we work with some customers around legacy modernization, where we do completely on Java Spring Boot, right? It's completely homegrown stacks, where we use some of the Netflix OSS tools. Again, I don't know how many of you are aware. There are Netflix Expo, has open sourced a lot of its chains, right? Including from DevOps to APIs. So we use a product called Istio for some of the Z-Swiss security that I was talking about a little earlier. So there are many of these examples that we can think. But what I think is important that I want to kind of start driving this message is, technology should not be the driving factor around how you solve. The approach should always be problem-centric, and think of how technology can help you doing that. And look at the ecosystem that you are driving in, the customer's environment or your own internal environments that it could be, right? Think of how do you leverage that ecosystem to kind of wire yourself for the growth, right? I think that's an important dimension that has actually helped us to grow with the way we have grown. So which then leads me to, and I think we have two more, and I'm trying to keep it within the 30 minutes that I was talking about right before our sleep cycle kicks in. So essentially what we have seen is, again, don't worry about how your infrastructure, is, right? Your infrastructure could be a on-premise hardware box, or it could be, cloud, or it could be a hybrid situation. But ensure that you have built out a well-defined DevOps methodology that is wired through automation. So hence, your ability to start adding features, running through changes, kind of happens very, very, succinctly, and you're able to start seeing the value coming out of that. So think through on your development methodologies first. That actually has a big impact on how you build it out. Okay. Then think of, should I do microservices? Should I do, standard APIs, or should I do something else? But that again is dependent on how do you want to drive your componentization thinking, right? Think of building blocks that are essentially composable together. If your business requires you to kind of change every 3 months, then your wiring of your APIs should be around how do you adapt to these quick changes. If it is more around, let's say once a year, my business methodologies never change at all, in which case, you think of how you want to wire your composition, right? So this again is an art. As you keep doing this, you start seeing the value coming out on that front. And more importantly, ensure that your services are wired right. You ensure you have the right telemetry coming out of it, because that is what will help you understand when your services fail, where they fail, and what is happening with your services. And if you want to remediate those services, that gives you a good way. So now with Dockers, we use Splunk. It used to not work earlier, right? There were some challenges around it, but we can now have, through Dockers, we can actually write to Splunk, and from Splunk, you can actually start getting dashboard. Again, Splunk doesn't have to be the only way. You can actually do through other means as well. And especially for microservices, that's a very strong point that I would tell you, that you should look at having the right telemetry levels done. Otherwise, you could run into unknown states, right? Which basically starts kicking in. And then think of how do you now data is the new oil, right? Everybody collects data from all of us, start capturing a whole bunch of data. But how do you wire all of these things together? How do you start drawing insights? Today, you have examples of Microsoft Lewis, that is a conversational API that gives you a lot of insights in as you start tapping into your data, right? And it's used extensively in, if you're thinking of mobile-based development. So think of how do you want to do your decentralized data management, and more importantly, how do you want to, give that feedback mechanism on your services itself. With that, I'll come to the last part, which is around, again, this is more to get you to think. As I said, a lot of this is with respect to, it's not just about trends. Trends can actually fizzle out as well. But what I think is important for us to look at is how is this API world, subscription-based economy, kind of changing how people start looking at, elements, right? So what we have done is to essentially break it down into 3 key segments. Think of APIs essentially becoming intelligent. There is an open API consortium for people if you know, right? It's part of your Linux Foundation. A lot of the products that you think are available, each of those products, they basically expose it as open APIs, okay? So there is a lot of traction around that. Look at the open API group. They expose a lot of the product-related APIs as open APIs, right, for people to consume. There is this whole intelligent API ecosystem that I was talking about. Microsoft Lewis is an example of that, right? Today, your intelligence is not, your API is not just some kind of a function block, right? It's also how is it doing something intelligently. So there are ways you can think of having your intelligent API ecosystem. More importantly, think through the security dimension. APIs can be an awesome experience if you know how to wire it right. If you think, otherwise you can actually start having hacks and issues. I know and I think Patrick was explaining in the previous, I think in the product engineering example, he was talking about this whole Facebook fiasco that happened last year, right? The way their intent was to actually share more data with you, but that was actually used in a different way. So think of your security as an important dimension. Verticalization of APIs, and then I gave this example of Apigee. You can actually now start composing your APIs together and actually start building very, very verticalized solutions. So your whole open banking API, it gives you, a bunch of capabilities around what you can do. And Apigee has a productized version of that that is there. You can either tap into it or you can think of building your own APIs, not as just microservices, but essentially stitching all of them together, right? So that's another example. Nanoservices is the one which can disrupt our thinking. People look at it, in a very, very mixed fashion. People say nanoservices is nothing but microservices. Anything that is less than 10K line of code, or 10 lines of code, is it nanoservice? Maybe not. But people are, if you look at, for example, AWS has its whole serverless application repository. And they basically say, I expose everything of whatever I need as a nanoservice, right? So there are different thinking around it again. But what essentially they say is, it's your lead indicator towards a serverless architecture. You show your Azure functions, your Lambda services, etc. They kind of get bucketed into that scenario. But that's the, I would say, the broad thinking of how you see it. So again, to summarize our conversation and to take it, give out as takeaways, right? One, there's the API economy is about not just for the net new, but also think of how you can wire your current system of systems, whatever the investments may be, how do you rewire that and think of it, and essentially build for the new, right? So that's going to be one. API is not just about building APIs, but it's also about an entire fundamental change around how you develop, how you deploy, how you wire it, how you use it internally, right? So there is a lot of things that starts kicking in, from mediation to security to orchestration capabilities to management to telemetry, right? So think of all of those dimensions and keep security as your fundamental. Security is your center point around which you have to drive your digital transformation. So think of that. That's an important dimension. And then more importantly, kind of rewire it to the thinking of what is required for the business first, and use that to design your APIs and your entire experiential stack, right? That is what I would call it. And then look at how the major market trends are essentially coming in. There could be a lot of these industrial products that are out there that can actually help you do things better. Hence, look at leveraging those to your advantage if it is allowed, right? And use to build on top of it rather than trying to do entirely ground up, because it's going to take you a lot more cycles. Again, it can be a very case different basis where we can think of it. And then, more importantly, when these trends happen, which are tech trends, ensure that you're kind of wiring those tech trends into and internalizing as part of your design thinking itself, right? So that, I think, is another important aspect that I would say. With that, I think I'm on the 30-minute mark. Thank you for listening to me so intently, and I could not see a face that was trying to close his eyes. So thank you. If there are any other questions, feel free to ask. We can have a separate conversation, and I can talk through it. Good. Thank you.
He was not off the mark when he said that he thrives in fuzziness. I mean, did he make it look easy or what? He just went through it as if it was not there. Okay, guys, any questions for him? We have plenty of time, and I think you should use the time because he's been in and out of the system so deep now. It's a deep track. You should have some deep questions for him. Yes, please.
The anatomy of that package, would it be like interdependent, or would it be linearly independent set of APIs? How would they glue together?
So I was giving this example on open banking, right? If you see what open banking basically says, it was essentially a consortium that was formed in the European market, primarily from the banks that was out there, right? What they were saying is the drive for that basically came from an industry that basically said, if you have an account with Lloyd's Bank, I should be able to move out of Lloyd's Bank into like our mobile portability, right? We have Airtel. Airtel sucks. In fact, I am having trouble with my phone. So I want to actually move into something else. Maybe idea is better here. I don't know, right? There is a mobile portability that came in, very similar. The open banking basically drove because of a need where if I'm a customer with a bank X, I want to be moving into a different bank. How easy is it for me to do it? We actually worked with a Norwegian bank called DNB. So they are in the business of banking, but they're also in the business of real estate. So they actually do real estate as well. So when you look at a mandate coming from a European Union, which is basically telling you that you should give me the flexibility, and with the GDPR guidance kicking in and PSD2 norms coming in, their interest was, can I have a mechanism where I can actually move you from a bank A to a bank B and actually have no loss in the experiences, right? That is the market driver that came in as a mandate, and hence every bank has to adopt to it. Now, when you think of that, the Open Banking Consortium was actually formed by about 6 to 8 banks that are in the European Union, and they basically defined this whole open banking API specification. And that specification today by APG has been implemented as a solution. So if you build if you are addressing, let's say, a banking customer in the European Union, or even in India, right? In fact, there is, with this Aadhaar integration and the BHIM and UPI, we are in a way we are actually supporting the whole open banking interface, right? So think of that kind of a situation, which is a market driver or a trend that is driving in that industry. Use that to your advantage and build out an ecosystem that addresses that change. What is open banking all about? It's about portability of a customer, the ability for me to find and get my balances irrespective of wherever am I, right? What do we do in an UPI, right? I actually have a phone pay or I have a Paytm, I can basically figure out what's my balance, right? So that's essentially what your open banking is all about. So that is the driver for the that verticalization. And again, I'm picking up a specific industry, and this can be applied to multiple industries, right? I can also give you an example of a manufacturing, where today, the way the manufacturing, and especially around thread manufacturing, right? You have a 9-month window where you essentially have to pick up all of your raw materials before you start doing a semi-processing on those threads. And you just have a 2-week window where you essentially have a customer basically saying, I want this many number of threads. How do you now kind of disrupt that market with a just-in-time printing of threads at the customer's location as needed, and you charge him by the number of meters he uses, right? That's a very specific manufacturing-related problem that we can actually use. With APIs, you can actually rewire the entire system of how for example, if you're using, let's say, some kind of an ERP to drive your order processing to invoice and to the manufacturing unit itself, that whole thing can be now rewired using an API economy. So that's a whole subscription economy, and I keep talking about is nothing but that thinking. I hope I answered the question for you.
Hi. Do we have any API level standardization, or does each of the industry have their own standards and they follow it the way they like?
So there is an API level standardization for sure, right? Like you have your WS stars, but if you talk about from a technology perspective, you have your WS standards, you have your messaging standards. There are very well-defined standards when it comes from a technology perspective. Again, there are standardization on the, by the industries as well, right? If you are addressing, like the example I was giving you on banking, then your PSD regulations, your GDPR regulations, they actually have an impact on how you wire your API, right? I can't put everything on, should I have the mechanism deletable, et cetera. So though they drive. So there are industry specific, there are horizontal specific, which are more. I think what is important for you is where in the industry you are and what are you thinking. If you're thinking of your own internal systems, then look at your API specifications, look at the open API specifications that are out there. Use that to wire your, your systems and use that specification so that, when you work with, let's say today an APG and tomorrow you decide that you do not want APG and you want to go an open source route and you want to move to WSO2, it makes that fundamental shift much easier rather than having to then think of re-engineering the entire solution itself.
Thank you.
So I'd like to ask you to share some experiences. If you've been a part of a migration journey of a product maybe, which was a monolithic web application, which has been turned into these microservices. And also if there are any stories around abuses of, I know you mentioned the line of code as one of the metrics, but microservices can be abused really badly. So any stories you've sort of witnessed?
Sure. So we work with a a very large telecom major in the US. And essentially, they are being tasked with moving all of their assets into AWS. And if you look at their, a typical telecom major is around their old BSS, OSS systems, which are decades old. And you look at some of them could be mainframe, some of them could be old Java stack, some of the unsupported versions of JDK that you have. When you look at such kind of legacy systems, and now you say, I need to rewire this entire thing into a cool microservices, AWS Lambda based, all on AWS services. You're like, should I now just drop this and build something new? Would it be easier? Or should I kind of think of re-engineering and rewiring it, right? So the approach that we have taken, I'll talk about my, our own personal experiences on how we did this, is to actually look at the entire system, and this is the example that I was telling. Somebody, just by the factor that they upgraded it to a Java Spring Boot, they basically said it is microservices. So when we actually walked in, we were told that we are all microservices ready, we are on the Java Spring Boot, we are all cool, right? That's the starting of our message. And when we go in and we do the assessment, we are like, man, there are 10,000, 20,000 lines of code, and so many lines of code. If you call that as a microservice, I will have to put my head into like an ostrich, and I have to say, okay, that's a world that I live in, right? But what we did was to actually assess their internal systems and use the thinking of saying, what is their ecosystem, right? It is a whole, like for example, they had JDK 1.6, some other versions that are not even there. So we had to first get them onto the next version, get them upgraded onto their JDK versions, right? They were using a lot of, there were a lot of security vulnerabilities that were out there. We had to solve some of those vulnerabilities before we say, now you are Spring Boot enabled. But that Spring Boot enabled doesn't necessarily mean it's microservices. You will have to re-engineer some of your, right? So you have to refactor some of the code and then bring in some of these open source solutions, which I was talking about from Netflix, right? Which can then start managing a lot of these, solutions. Once you do that, then you're essentially starting a journey. And that journey basically takes you step by step towards a microservices-based economy. Once you do that, then you think of putting that into Kubernetes clusters and then host that as part of your AWS infrastructure. So that's a example that I can talk to you about how it is. So when I said about the abuse is people think because I am on, let's say, that specific version, like, Spring Boot, I'm automatically microservices enabled. You're not, right? Because that has the fundamental shift that has to change. And people either give you that quantitative specification, because as humans, we are very quantitative driven. If I tell you 1, 2, 3, all of us will understand the same thing. If I say, this seems to be slightly better than the other one, that slightly better for each of us is very, very different, correct? So I think it is important to wire that thinking and see how we want to adopt that journey. So that's where the abuse part of it comes in, and that's why I started off the statement saying 10 to 100K lines of code is essentially what a typical microservice should look like. Now let's talk about how is your services written, and then the thinking goes. I hope I answered that question for you.
So my question follows on the same lines. When you talk about decentralized data, right? That is one of the biggest challenge that we face. Customers have their data which is moving, and then you bring in microservices. You are talking about service having its own data, but really that discussion, it's too difficult to re-architect the data layer, and that's where some of the times you get how do you address that?
See, again, you will have to see what you're trying to wire for, right? And again, it can't be like a guidance. I can only talk to you as a guidance because we'll have to understand what is your exact situation, and then I can tell you exactly how we can think of rewiring it. But one thing that we always do when we talk about microservices, right? You talk about your stateless microservices, you talk about your stateful microservices. The ideal state is your microservices, the core operation and the data that it does is kind of one single package, so that it helps you to kind of rewire and take it to the future. But that is not the case always. And hence what happens is you still refer to some database that is out there and all the services tap into it. Now what you start doing is you start creating the traffic jams that we were talking about, right? Pune, interestingly, doesn't have that much traffic jam. I'm very, very thankful. If you come to my city, Bangalore, you will see what is traffic jam really means, right? So what we essentially get to is we'll have to understand how you want to rewire your systems. If it allows us to change or chunk our data out, then I would say take that approach, because in the long run, it helps you to do it better. But if there is, if it cannot be, then I think the right way for you to do is continue to exist the way it is. And I said, this is a journey, right? It can't be like, one day we will do that operation and then we'll do a switchover. It doesn't happen. It is kind of an iterative process where you keep building on it. So what you have to wire for is, I can continue to keep my database and all my data into one single data store, right? And I can have my services start tapping into it. I'll have to obviously increase my bandwidth of how I connect to these services. But then at some point in time, I start chunking out my non-critical data, things that are more, logs, etc., right? Kind of start wiring them, take it out, and then figure out how the system starts behaving. And then eventually start chunking your core systems into that microservices plus data, right? That essentially should be the approach of how you should drive it. But again, as I said, it's easy to sell this, but when you start actually going through it, it is a huge amount of pain. And as I said, it is very, very contextual to the needs that comes in, and it has to be wired very differently. But that's broadly I would say, the guidance that you can think of. Okay? All right. So, any other questions? I'm out there at the booth. We'll catch and we can talk more. Pleasure talking to you. It's been fundamental, great.
Thank you, Chander, for that flawless presentation, very high energy one at that. I think, guys, we need to return that energy back to him. Come on. Loud. And one more for Brillio for being a gold sponsor to this event. One more round of applause, please.